Have you noticed how some seasons of life do not end with a big dramatic moment, but with a quiet internal click? Nothing explodes, nothing announces itself. You just wake up one day and realize the old version of your life feels strangely far away. The routines that used to hold your attention feel flat. The conversations that used to feel normal start sounding small, and the version of you that once fit into all of it does not fit anymore. That is the kind of shift a lot of people do not know how to explain at first. They think something is wrong. They think they are becoming distant, too sensitive, too serious, too hard to please. But sometimes what is actually happening is much deeper than that. Sometimes your life is not falling apart. Sometimes it is outgrowing itself. And when that happens, the feeling can be unsettling because you are still standing inside familiar walls, but you no longer belong to the same inner world that built them. You start noticing things you used to overlook. You stop forcing yourself to stay impressed by what once distracted you. You become more aware of what drains you, what steadies you, and what quietly changes you from the inside out. That is what this message is about. Not a prediction, not a guarantee, not a mystical shortcut, just a grounded look at what it means when your inner life starts moving in a new direction, and why that can feel like confirmation that the old chapter is truly closing. Because for many people, the victory is not loud, it is internal. It shows up as clarity, courage, restraint, peace, and the ability to stop returning to what used to break your focus. And once that shift happens, there is no unseeing it. When your old world starts feeling too small, there is a very specific kind of discomfort that comes when your environment no longer matches who you are becoming. You can still do everything the same way you used to do it. You can show up to work, answer the messages, keep the schedule, smile in the right places, and say the right things. But something in you is no longer fully participating. It is like part of your mind has stepped back and started observing the entire setup with new eyes. That is often the first sign of change, not excitement but distance. And distance is not always a bad thing. Sometimes distance is where honesty begins. When your old life starts to feel too small, it usually means your inner standards have changed before your outer circumstances have caught up. What used to feel acceptable now feels heavy. What used to feel exciting now feels distracting. What used to feel normal now feels misaligned. A lot of people panic when this happens because they assume they have become ungrateful or disconnected. But more often, they are simply more awake. You may begin noticing that you can no longer ignore the cost of things you once called normal. The gossip feels exhausting. The performance feels empty. The need to constantly explain yourself starts feeling unnecessary. Even the way you spend your time begins to matter in a new way. You become aware that not every invitation deserves a yes. Not every conversation deserves your energy. Not every old pattern deserves another round. That awareness can feel lonely at first, because growth does not always arrive with a crowd. Sometimes it arrives quietly, and it separates you from the noise before it brings you into something better. And that separation can be confusing if you expected transformation to feel more inspiring in the moment. But many real turning points do not feel inspiring at first. They feel clarifying. It is the moment you stop negotiating with what is clearly finished, not because you suddenly hate everything from your past. Not because you are trying to reinvent yourself into someone unreachable, but because you can feel very plainly that you have already learned what that season had to teach you. The old room is still there. The old habits are still there. The old version of your identity may even still be trying to speak, but you are no longer fully living under its rules. That matters, because the end of an old life is not always about leaving a place. Sometimes it is about leaving an agreement, the internal agreement that says you have to shrink to stay safe. The agreement that says you have to keep repeating what no longer works. The agreement that says discomfort is always a sign to go back instead of a sign to grow forward. When that agreement breaks, your whole inner world starts reorganizing itself. And once that happens, you begin to realize something important. Peace is not always found by adding more. Sometimes it is found by subtracting what no longer belongs. The season of isolation that was actually making you stronger. One of the hardest parts of growth is that it can make you feel alone before it makes you feel free. People talk about transformation like it is always uplifting, but real change can be strangely quiet. Sometimes it pulls you inward, it makes you reflect more than you speak, it makes you selective in ways you cannot always explain. It makes old friendships feel less automatic. It makes small talk feel even smaller. And suddenly you are standing in a space where your inner world is expanding, but your outer world has not caught up yet. That gap can feel uncomfortable. You may begin to feel like no one around you fully sees what is happening inside you. They still know the old version, they still respond to the old patterns, they still expect the same reactions, the same availability, the same energy. But you are not operating from the same place anymore. That mismatch can create a strange kind of loneliness. And if you are not careful, you can mistake that loneliness for failure. You may think, why do I feel so different from everyone else? Or, why does it feel like I am drifting from the people and places that used to feel so familiar? But growth often asks for a period of separation so that your identity can become clearer without constant interruption. Psychologically, that makes sense. When you are changing deeply, you start noticing the role you used to play in other people's lives. Maybe you were the one who always accommodated. Maybe you were the one who laughed things off. Maybe you were the one who absorbed everyone else's stress so that no one had to sit with your own. Maybe you were the one who kept the peace by staying quiet. And then one day, that role stops fitting. Not because you became cold, not because you stopped caring, but because you no longer want to survive by disappearing into other people's comfort. That is a difficult adjustment. It is easier to stay visible in ways that cost you nothing. It is easier to repeat old social patterns than to let your identity become more honest. But honesty has a way of making your world simpler, even when it makes it smaller for a while. You begin to prefer fewer conversations with more substance, fewer obligations with more integrity, fewer people around you who only know how to receive and not how to understand. And in that space, it can feel like you are being left behind, but often you are being cleared out of noise. That does not mean you will never connect deeply again. It means you are learning not to confuse constant access with actual closeness. The loneliness of growth is real, but so is the strength it builds. Because every time you sit with yourself instead of rushing back into old distractions, you become more familiar with your own mind. Every time you resist the urge to perform, you become more rooted in who you are without an audience. Every time you tolerate the awkwardness of becoming different, you get stronger at trusting your own direction. That strength is part of the confirmation. Not because it proves you are above anyone else, it does not, but because it shows that your old coping mechanisms no longer have the same control over you. And that is not small. The moment your reactions start changing. Another quiet sign that an old life is ending is when your reactions stop matching your old patterns. This is one of the most revealing shifts because it happens in ordinary moments. Someone says something that would have triggered you before, and now you pause instead of reacting. A situation that used to pull you into panic now feels manageable. A comment that once would have sent you spiraling now passes through without landing the same way. That does not mean you are numb. It means you are changing your relationship to pressure. A lot of transformation is not about becoming someone else. It is about becoming less controlled by the reflexes that once ran your life. Maybe you used to explain yourself endlessly when you felt misunderstood. Now you are learning that not everything needs a defense. Maybe you used to chase closure from people who are never going to give it. Now you are learning to give yourself permission to move on without a perfect conversation. Maybe you used to let one bad moment decide your whole emotional state. Now you are noticing that you can feel something deeply without letting it define you. That is maturity, not perfect calm, not spiritual performance, not pretending you never get hurt. Maturity is the ability to hold your experience without being consumed by it. And once you start operating from that place, your life changes in ways that are easy to miss unless you are paying attention. You stop reacting to every closed door as if it means rejection. You start seeing that some delays are actually redirections in disguise, not because they were sent to teach you a lesson in some dramatic way, but because life often reveals mismatches through timing. You stop chasing things just because they are familiar, and that is a major turning point, because familiarity is one of the strongest emotional traps people have. The mind loves what it knows, even when what it knows is painful. That is why a lot of people stay in jobs, friendships, habits, and identities long after they have stopped serving them. They are not always staying because they are happy. They are staying because the unknown requires courage. But when your reactions start changing, it often means courage has started to outweigh comfort. You are no longer willing to sabotage your peace just to preserve old routines. You are no longer willing to answer every pull from the past just because it still has your attention. You are learning to sit in the pause between stimulus and response, and that pause is where your new life begins, not in fantasy, in restraint, in awareness, in choice. That is why the change can feel so powerful and so quiet at the same time, because the real shift is not that life has suddenly become easy. The real shift is that you are no longer being ruled by the same inner chaos. Why you keep outgrowing people's places and patterns. At some point, most people who are going through a deep identity shift ask themselves the same question: why does everything feel like it is changing around me? The answer is usually not that the world has turned against you. More often, it is that your priorities have changed so much that the same environments no longer feed the same version of you. This is where a lot of people get stuck, because they think growth should make them more adaptable to everything. But real growth does not make you compatible with every space. Sometimes it makes you more sensitive to what does not belong. You begin to notice the difference between what supports you and what merely occupies you. Some places drain you because they were built for an earlier version of your life. Some people still relate to the version of you who overgave, over-explained, over-apologized, or overextended. And some patterns keep returning because they are emotionally efficient, not because they are healthy. That is why growth can feel like a series of quiet exits, not dramatic exits, clear ones. You stop forcing participation where there is no reciprocity. You stop pretending you are excited by things that only keep you busy. You stop staying in conversations that only ask you to perform. You stop making yourself smaller so that other people do not have to adjust. And every one of those decisions builds identity, because identity is not just what you believe about yourself. It is what you repeatedly allow, tolerate, protect, and walk away from. That is the part many people miss. A change in identity is not mainly a feeling. It is a pattern of consistent internal choices. You choose not to chase what destabilizes you. You choose not to explain your growth to people committed to misunderstanding it. You choose not to rebuild old cycles just because they are emotionally recognizable. You choose not to trade your clarity for temporary belonging, and that is where the old life begins to lose its grip. Not because the past disappears. It does not. It still exists in memory, habit, and emotion. But it no longer gets to define your future behavior. That is a huge difference. A lot of people think they need a big emotional breakthrough before they can change. But often the breakthrough is simply the moment they stop identifying with what keeps them stuck. It might look small from the outside, no big announcement, no dramatic speech, just a quieter way of moving through the world. But inside, it is everything, because once you stop treating old patterns as your identity, you start making room for a more honest version of yourself to come forward. And honestly, that can feel both relieving and terrifying. Relieving because you no longer have to carry what never fit. Terrifying because now you are responsible for becoming intentional. That responsibility is not punishment. It is freedom. Mid-video reflection. If this is landing with you, pause for a second and comment the word alignment. Vinguladik Skuji. At Gojia2 score, just comment alignment in the comments. And while you are here, take a second to like the video and subscribe to Born into Light, because this is exactly the kind of space where we slow down, think clearly, and talk honestly about real inner change. Now let us keep going. The quiet battle between comfort and truth. One of the most honest things about growth is that it often puts comfort and truth in direct conflict. Comfort says, stay where you are, even if you feel drained. Truth says, be honest about what is no longer working. Comfort says, keep the peace by avoiding the conversation. Truth says, the peace was never real if it depended on your silence. Comfort says, do what is expected so nothing gets awkward. Truth says, awkwardness is often the first sign that you are finally being real. That inner conflict can be exhausting, because neither side disappears easily. Even when you know what is right for you, the old emotional muscle memory can still try to pull you backward. That is why so many people feel stuck right before a major shift in perspective. It is not always because they lack discipline. Sometimes it is because they are standing in the middle of a psychological tug-of-war. The old self wants the predictable discomfort it knows. The growing self wants the uncertain peace it has not fully lived yet. That is a real battle. And the thing about this battle is that it does not always end with a victorious speech or a massive decision. Sometimes it ends with one quiet refusal. You do not text back right away. You do not reopen the conversation. You do not re-enter the pattern. You do not make yourself available to something that keeps pulling you out of alignment. That is how maturity often looks. Not as a flashy breakthrough, but as a repeated decision not to betray your own awareness. And every time you do that, the old life weakens a little more. Because the old life survives on your automatic participation. It survives when you go back to what hurts, because it is familiar. It survives when you choose the easier lie over the harder truth. It survives when you confuse intensity with meaning. It survives when you let guilt talk you into abandoning yourself. But once you begin telling the truth to yourself, the pattern starts to change. You may still feel the tug. You may still miss what was comfortable. You may still wonder whether you are overreacting. But deep down you start to recognize the difference between fear and intuition. Fear says, stay because leaving is unfamiliar. Intuition says, this no longer matches who you are becoming. That is not a prophecy. It is discernment. And discernment is one of the most valuable signs of internal growth because it does not need applause. It just quietly improves the way you move through life. You stop confusing urgency with importance. You stop confusing attention with value. You stop confusing old attachment with true belonging. That shift changes everything, not all at once, but enough to matter. What real victory actually looks like. When people hear the word victory, they often imagine something loud, visible and externally confirmed. But in a real inner life sense, victory usually looks much simpler than that. It looks like you not abandoning yourself when no one is watching. It looks like you staying calm where you used to spiral. It looks like you leaving the room with your dignity intact. It looks like you choosing rest over self-destruction. It looks like you stopping the habit of making your life harder than it needs to be. That is victory, not the fantasy of never struggling again, not the performance of endless positivity, not the pressure to appear unbothered. Real victory is when your behavior starts matching your values more often than your fear. That is why the end of an old life can feel like confirmation, because you finally see that the version of you who used to be pulled in every direction is no longer the one driving. You are still human. You still have moments of doubt. You still remember old pain. You still get tired, but you are no longer living as if those things get the final word. That is a huge internal win. And from the outside, people may not even understand what changed. They may just say you seem different, calmer, clearer, less available for nonsense, less reactive, more grounded. That is what happens when a person begins to move from survival into awareness. You become less interested in impressing people and more interested in being intact, less interested in being chosen by everyone, and more interested in choosing what is honest, less interested in chasing proof, and more interested in living with self-respect. And that self-respect changes your whole atmosphere, not because it makes you superior, it does not, but because it makes you harder to pull away from yourself. That is the kind of confirmation that matters, not a dramatic sign in the sky, a stable shift in the way you carry your life. The old chapter is over when you stop arguing with the truth that it cannot give you what it once promised. The old chapter is over when you can remember it without wanting to rebuild it. The old chapter is over when peace becomes more attractive than repetition. And when that happens, you do not need to force a celebration. The silence itself is the proof. The identity change. Nobody sees at first. Some of the deepest transformation happens at the level of identity, and that part is often invisible to other people until much later. Identity is not just what you say you are. It is what you expect from life, what you tolerate, what you return to, what you believe you deserve, and what you no longer make excuses for. So when identity changes, it often begins with small internal revisions. You stop saying, "This is just how I am," when what you really mean is, "This is what I learned to survive." You stop assuming that discomfort means danger. You stop treating your old coping mechanisms like personality traits. You stop confusing self-protection with self-sabotage. That is deep work, because once you see your patterns clearly, you have less interest in romanticizing what kept you stuck, and this is where maturity becomes important. Maturity is not losing sensitivity. It is refining it. It is not becoming cold. It is becoming more discerning. It is not needing less love. It is needing less chaos. It is needing less chaos. It is not shutting people out. It is becoming honest about access. That kind of change can feel like a loss to the old self. The old self often wants the thrill of unfinished business, the emotional highs and lows, the constant pull toward what is unresolved. But the growing self wants coherence. The growing self wants a life that feels livable, not just intense. The growing self wants consistency, not emotional fireworks. The growing self wants a future that does not require constant self-abandonment. And once that desire becomes stronger than the old familiar pull, the identity shift has already begun. You may notice it in the way you talk. Your language gets cleaner, less self-blaming, less apologetic, more direct, more honest. You may notice it in the way you spend your time. You may notice it in what no longer interests you. You may notice it in how quickly you can sense when something is off. You may notice it in how little you need to prove now compared to before. Those are all signs that the center of gravity has changed. You are no longer orbiting old fear in the same way. You are no longer giving your energy away as casually. You are no longer mistaking old survival skills for identity. That is profound. Because the moment you stop identifying with what broke you, you make room for what actually reflects your growth. And growth is not always glamorous. Sometimes it is plain. Sometimes it is repetitive. Sometimes it is just one honest day after another. But plain is not empty, quiet is not weak, careful is not fearful. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is become less reactive, more grounded, and more faithful to their own inner clarity. That is a life changing in real time. When the old story no longer fits, every life is shaped by stories, and not all of them are spoken out loud. Some stories sound like, "I always end up here." Some sound like, "I have to earn love by overfunctioning." Some sound like, "Nothing ever really changes." Some sound like, "If I let go, I will lose everything." Some sound like, "If I let go, I will lose everything." Some sound like, "I can handle more than I actually can." Some sound like, "This is as good as it gets." Those stories are powerful because they organize behavior before you even notice they are running in the background. But at some point, growth begins to interrupt the script. You start seeing evidence that your old story is not the whole truth. Maybe you do leave. Maybe you do survive. Maybe you do recover. Maybe you do survive. Maybe you do recover. Maybe you do stop repeating the same mistake. Maybe you do become calmer than you used to be. Maybe you do build a life that feels more like home than hustle. And once that happens, the old story starts losing authority. That can feel strange because even a painful story can feel safer than no story at all. At least pain is familiar. At least the old explanation gives you something to hold on to. But when the old story no longer fits, keeping it becomes its own kind of suffering. So you start revising it, not by pretending the past never happened, not by denying what was hard, but by refusing to let the hardest parts become the defining parts. That is where healing and maturity meet. Healing says, "I can tell the truth without being trapped by it." Maturity says, "I do not have to keep building my life around what hurt me." Growth says, "I can honor what was real without living there forever." That is how old identities dissolve. Not all at once. In layers. A little less fear here, a little less apology there, a little less tolerance for chaos, a little more trust in your own discernment, a little more willingness to be still instead of rushing back into the familiar. And then one day, you look around and realize the old story is no longer the story you are living. That is a quiet kind of victory. Not loud, not performative, but real. Posing the new chapter is built on truth. So when it feels like your old life is over, it may not mean that everything has suddenly become perfect. It may simply mean that the part of you built for survival is no longer in charge. It may mean you are thinking more clearly. It may mean you are carrying yourself with more honesty. It may mean you are less available for what drains you. It may mean you are finally seeing that peace is not found by going back, but by going deeper into who you really are now. That is the kind of change that lasts, not because it is dramatic, because it is dramatic, because it is true. And truth has a way of confirming itself over time. You do not need to force a grand explanation for it. You do not need to perform certainty. You do not need to make it bigger than it is. Just notice what is changing in you. Notice what no longer fits. Notice what no longer pulls you in. Notice what feels heavier than it used to. Notice what feels clearer than it used to. Notice where you have become more grounded, more selective, more aware. That is not nothing. That is your inner life telling the truth before your outer life fully catches up. And once you start living from that truth, the old chapter really does lose its hold. Not because you were rescued from life, because you grew into a self that no longer belongs to the old way of surviving. So keep listening, keep noticing, keep choosing what is honest, keep choosing what is steady, keep choosing what reflects your real becoming. The old life does not get to define you anymore. What comes next is built from awareness, not pressure, from maturity, not confusion, from clarity, not chaos, and that is a victory worth recognizing. If this message spoke to you, stay connected with Born into Light and carry this with you today. Sometimes the strongest confirmation is not a sign outside of you. Sometimes it is the quiet certainty that you are no longer the same person who used to live inside that old story.